If you've been struggling with weight gain, sluggishness, or changing metabolism, I have a free gift for you that is going to be a game changer. I want to offer you my free, no excuses, light and easy lunch guide to boost midlife metabolism. Inside this ebook, you'll not only get tons of simple and doable meal planning how-tos and tips, you'll get my favorite, quick, ridiculously delicious recipes. And you'll also receive my exact 3-step formula to guide your food choices so you'll know exactly what to put on your plate. Boosting your energy and feeling lighter doesn't have to be hard, and I'm going to prove it to you with this free guide. You can get the instant download using the link below. It's only going to be available for a limited time, so be sure to grab it before it goes away. Welcome to Boss Body, the podcast where successful women learn how to lose weight and get healthy in a way they can live forever. If you're successful in so many areas of your life, but can't seem to give yourself the same care and compassion you show everyone else, you're in the right place. I'm your host, Sarah Haas, women's weight loss and body love coach, and I'm here to help you create the light, joyful, energetic life you deserve. Hi, everybody. Welcome. This is Sarah Haas. You're listening to the Boss Body podcast. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to be here with me. We have what I consider a really important topic today. My guest is Diane Petrella. She is a clinical psychotherapist, and she's also the author of a book, Healing Emotional Eating for Trauma Survivors. So I just want to give a quick warning to listeners that we are going to be talking about trauma. We're going to be talking about the connection to emotional eating. And if this is a sensitive topic for you or you feel that it may be triggering, listen as you are comfortable. But I just wanted to put that out there for those who are listening that this will be somewhat sensitive topic for some of you. But Diane, I think this is such an important conversation. It's something that I see so often in my work with women. And I think that the book you have written is just beautiful, and it encompasses everything that I talk with clients about who do have a history of trauma, and it manifests in emotional eating. And I appreciate that you have really taken a deeper dive into this, so much so that you have written this just absolutely beautiful, compassionate book and teaching us not just the connection, but how to overcome and how to come out on the other side with that self-love and that body love. So, Diane, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me, Sarah, and thank you for those beautiful and kind words about my book, for today. Thank you. It's an honor to be here.
Absolutely,
Truly.
absolutely. So, I understand you are a clinical holistic psychotherapist. Can you tell us a little bit about what that means, and also what's your history with this and how did you come to do this type of work?
Yeah. My psychotherapy degree is in clinical social work. So I have an MSW. And many years ago now, it's been decades that I've been practicing, but I was originally trained as a child therapist. And my very first job after graduate school in the mid 80s was to help start with somebody else in a child psychiatric outpatient department of a child psychiatric hospital. We started, which was at that time the first child sexual abuse program in Rhode Island. And it was unique at that point because the issue of incest and sexual abuse was just beginning to be brought more out into media attention and even to clinical circles. So That was primarily what I did at the time. I worked with children and adolescents who had been sexually abused. Some may still have been living in their homes. Some have been removed from their families. Some were abused by people in their families, some by people outside of their families. I worked with perpetrators of child sexual abuse as well. So that was the main focus of my work, as well as that expanded into adults who were sexually abused as children, and then all forms of trauma. So I worked with children who experienced physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, abandonment, the whole range of traumatic experiences, abusive and other kinds of traumatic experiences. There may have been children that weren't sexually abused, but experienced the upset or trauma of a divorce or the death of a parent or mental illness or addictions. And some of that's traumatic, and some of it may not have been traumatic, depending on how like for divorce, it's always traumatic for children. But there's a continuum of trauma from more severe abuse to other kinds of experiences that overwhelm the system, but perhaps not to the same degree as overt abuse. But in any event, so in working with children and adults at that point, I began to work with um, adolescents and adults who were also exhibiting an issue with using food to soothe themselves. And at that time, I worked with a dietitian who was very astute, and she was aware that many of the patients, well, I call them clients, but her patients who were referred to her or wanted to meet with her around weight loss issues, she was very astute and did a history, and many of them had experienced some kind of trauma, and many of which had experienced sexual abuse that she had picked up on, and referred her clients to me because she was aware she couldn't really address emotional eating and some of the concerns they had around body image without their attending to their history. So we worked together for a long time. She would address dietetics and, the nutritional aspects, and I would work with them around trauma healing and the emotional aspects of what would lead them to using food to ground and soothe themselves and really just to feel better because of how overwhelming trauma can be in the mind, body, and spirit.
I see that so often. And I know that a lot of times women come to me usually because they want to release weight. That's their first, they feel like that is the issue. The weight is the issue. Every now and then I come across someone who wants to actually gain weight, who's struggling, to gain weight. And a lot of times it comes from the same place. And it is a form of disordered eating where what you say you want to do doesn't seem to be happening. And why is that? And women tend to blame themselves. They say, "Oh, I just don't have willpower. I just need to be more disciplined. I just don't stick to what I say I'm going to do." And when I start asking questions, how did you grow up? What was your mom like? What was her attitude around food or eating? A lot of times these deeper issues of trauma come up and they had never really made that connection. They know they'll say I'm an emotional eater. They'll say I eat when I'm lonely or when I'm stressed or when I'm bored, but I don't a lot of them have not really made that connection to when I was a child, as I was growing up, when I was a teen, whatever it is, I had an absent parent, or I was abused physically or sexually or emotionally, or I was neglected, or we had food insecurity, addiction, a parent with an addiction, or a caregiver, or, there's, like you said, such a spectrum of trauma that we experience. And a lot of times it's not just one thing, it can be a culmination of things.
Mhm.
But that really is a pattern of unhealed trauma, and the disordered way of eating or the overeating, whatever, is really just the manifestation. And I try to teach them that the eating is a symptom. It isn't the root. It's not the root. And until you really get to the root and work through that, this pattern is going to keep repeating itself because I can give you all the nutrition advice, all the exercises, you can read books, you can get recipes. But if you're having these uncontrollable cravings and you're eating when you aren't hungry and when you don't want to eat, then that's a signal that something's out of balance. And it's usually more mental, emotional, spiritual than it is physical.
Exactly. And I want to emphasize something you said for those listening who are struggling with using food for self-comfort, self-soothing. It's not your fault, and you do not lack willpower. It's really hard to deal with the emotional and physiological effects of childhood trauma. When I say childhood, I'm including adolescence in there as well. So when a child or teen is traumatized and there is a lack of support, and sometimes even when there is support, some traumas are just so hard to deal with. And for the developing child in particular, it affects their physiology and their brain in terms of the stress response. So that for some children, they may, because of what is happening around them and the lack of support or guidance to walk them through it or to even acknowledge that something's happening, which is often the case with sexual abuse, that there's what's considered a hypersensitivity to stress. So that you may be on guard, you may be hyper vigilant, it may feel hard to relax. So that even normative stress that children and teens and we all experience in life may be experienced by the mind body physiologically by the brain as something more extraordinary to have to cope with that can be a quick heightened response of fear in the body, tension in the body. That's where the amygdala, which is in the limbic part of our brain and can easily get activated when we're stressed. One thing I suggest to people kind of in the very beginning, when as they're making the connection between early trauma and using food to cope and how early trauma can affect their nervous system, is to learn what's called diaphragmatic breathing. And what that means is the diaphragm is a muscle below behind the rib cage, below the lungs, and it's activated when we take deep belly breaths, abdominal breathing. Some people may be familiar with this if they take yoga classes. And the difference between a diaphragmatic breath would be shallow breathing. When we're stressed, this is a physiological sign of stress or symptom of stress. For any of us, when we're stressed and we're kind of in that hyper aroused state, that fear-based state, we just naturally begin to take shorter, shallower breaths. But then we're not getting the full relaxing benefits of the breath when we're breathing in a shallow way. Generally, babies are born breathing diaphragmatically, and just through the stress and strain of life, even some children may stop breathing that way. And there's always going to be times when we're stressed and we're breathing, taking shorter, shallower breaths. But when you know the difference between a diaphragmatic breath and a shallow breath, you can use that as an opportunity to calm yourself by consciously focusing on breathing. And I teach people this by suggesting they put one hand on their upper chest, one hand on their abdomen, and just breathe naturally and see which hand is moving more than the other hand. Mostly both will be moving a little bit. But if you notice that the hand on your upper chest is moving a lot and the lower one isn't, chances are you're naturally breathing from the upper part of your chest. And so like a bellows, as you breathe in, your abdomen expands. As you exhale and breathe out, like a bellows, your abdomen will contract, your belly will contract. So there's lots of videos and whatnot about learning how to breathe diaphragmatically. And then, of course, there's so many different breathing exercises to use. But diaphragmatic breathing is something that when you're beginning to feel the urge to use food and you're aware that you're not necessarily physically hungry, you can pause with taking several deep diaphragmatic breaths that might just give you a little bit of space to make a mindful choice and reflective ability to notice what's going on. You had mentioned about food cravings, and I want to point out that there is a difference between a food craving because you're craving something sweet or maybe something salty. That's okay. Go ahead, satisfy that. But there's also emotional cravings that get confused with a food craving, that there's the emotional craving that it's not always clear that that's really what's behind the need for a particular food. When that's going on, it may be hard to stop after a reasonable portion that feels satisfying to your body. So, diaphragmatic breathing and also using that with other kinds of breathing exercises people may have learned. Excuse me, there's one called box breathing or four-step breathing that actually, I believe it's the Navy SEALs and probably other divisions of the military that use this under stressful situations. So you breathe in, inhale to the count of, say, 4. I usually do around 4, sometimes longer than that, may be hard for people, but however many moments is comfortable. So you breathe in, inhale, 2, 3, 4, hold the breath, 2, 3, 4. Exhale, 2, 3, 4. Hold the breath, 2, 3, 4. And do that for several rounds. That's just a simple tip to, I'm not even going to say calm your body, but settle your body even a little bit so that you may be less reactive to acting on the agitation and the stress in your body that will just help you make a more mindful choice if you're struggling at that point.
That is a really great tip because it's something that is very accessible. It's accessible to anyone at any time, and it doesn't take a lot of time.
Right.
Sometimes we think of something that we're wanting to work on or overcome, and it just seems like a big mountain to climb. And I love that you're giving people a first step. But if I want to go back a little bit
Yeah.
to those who haven't really made that connection yet to the trauma that they experienced and how that can manifest in the disordered eating, overeating, whatever it is you want to call it. How did you start seeing that connection? And when people develop this reliance on food from childhood trauma, so let's say they're a child or an adolescent, does the food start coming in immediately, or is this something we experience later in life? And
Right.
exactly what are we using it for? Why
Yeah.
does food help us through these situations?
Those are great questions. Um, because my clinical experience was and has been primarily, I'm a trauma therapist. It started, early in my career, even in my internships, working with kids who were traumatized. It was very clear. I saw that connection. And then as I worked with adults, using food as a way of coping because I was learning that they were eating to a point where and it wasn't always about weight issues. They were using food in a way that they felt uncomfortable in their bodies and somehow just using it in a way that they themselves would describe numbing themselves out, getting into a food coma. Um, and of course, as a therapist, if I see somebody for the first time, for whatever the reason is, I always do take a history. So I'm asking the kinds of questions that helps me, even if they don't come because they were traumatized, I will learn about things that happened to them, who was in their family, the makeup of their nuclear family, if there were um, divorces, addictions, how they were disciplined, how they were treated, who was there for them, how safe did they feel? Certain questions to help people really begin a process of therapy, even if we weren't going to address those things. It's always a choice I will offer to my clients. I may point something out that, with what you're describing, that would be hard for any child to cope with. And I'll do a little psychoeducation about how trauma stays in our mind and body. Oh, and I will speak to something about that in a minute. So I will give them some education around them, and they can decide whether they want to go there or not, depending on what they're coming to talk with me about. One thing that might be useful, kind of digressing a little bit, but I think is useful, that if some people may not think that what happened to them growing up was traumatic. So I'll ask questions. How safe did you feel? How supported did you feel? When you were upset, who could you go to? Do you remember what would be a time in your life that you felt most sad? What was the time you felt most supported? So there are questions people can reflect on as well. There are certain experiences that most likely has led to some degree of trauma-based behaviors later on. We talked about some of those more obvious ones of abuse. But regarding when somebody's traumatized, whatever the experience was that they had, if the feelings were not acknowledged and addressed and processed during that time, they stay in our mind and body. So I often say feelings are timeless. If something wasn't processed and healed, and healing doesn't mean it's 100% healed and released from our minds and bodies forever, and that's okay. But if they weren't addressed, they stay in our mind and body, so that if someone's triggered by something that happens, say somebody has an argument with their boss, or they're being chastised by their boss, and they're feeling a sense of shame. The argument with the boss may have triggered shame that was already there. Chances are, when there are some predominant feelings that we tend to experience over and over again, it could be a quick to anger or rage, shame, easily feeling guilty, low self-worth. Chances are it's those feelings are being brought to the surface by something happening today. So it might be real what's happening today, and you need to learn to set boundaries or be assertive, or, whatever the issues may be. But what's happening today isn't necessarily causing the enormity of what you're feeling in your body that leads you to turning to food.
Yeah, so it's kind of, I don't like to say overreaction because that makes us instantly feel at fault or blaming ourselves. But maybe, I don't know a better way to say it, but a bigger reaction than what that situation necessarily calls for, because of it's bringing back old feelings that you experienced in the past. And I think something that you mentioned was really important. It's that some people don't feel that they experienced trauma because if it wasn't something major like a sexual abuse or something like that, but it could be, you said divorce is traumatic for kids. Maybe you had a lot of siblings and the parents just couldn't give you
Right.
enough focused time and listening to you and helping you process through emotions because you're young and you couldn't do it yourself. Or maybe you had a single mom who was working all the time. So it's not just something, like you said, there's a spectrum. So it doesn't have to be I think really none of us escape childhood unscathed. There are always all these dynamics going on. And I think it's important too not to always put the blame on the parents or what, because I know as a mom, I certainly am not perfect. And I have all these things with my kids that I regret or I wish I had done better. we're imperfect. We don't always see what a child needs or understand what they need. We only know what we know. We know what we experienced and we know how we experienced our parents, and that informs how we then parent.
Absolutely. Oh, absolutely. And it's not about blame at all. It's not about blame at all. And, many of the people I worked with, the ones who were abused by parents, their parents, for the most part, experience their own trauma. And if there isn't an opportunity for somebody to heal, we all perpetuate things that we experienced early on until and unless we had either the awareness that some people are able to have and other people don't. And who knows what the difference is with that, but it's not about blame at all. And I'm really clear when I work with people that that's not what's happening, because some people feel a sense of betrayal to their parents when they maybe, if the trauma happened in their family. It can also be a trauma that happened outside of the family, and then an additional trauma could be not talking about it. Secrecy, as you see, I there's a section in my book on secrecy and how traumatic that can be. But it's absolutely not about blaming parents. It is about acknowledging and honoring and acknowledging and honoring the truth about your early experiences, just what the truth is, with no blame. Just what is the truth? And there are a couple things I'd like to get back to. You mentioned about the word overreaction. I know what you're saying, that sometimes leads people, it's used in a way of blaming. I do use that word because I think it has been used sometimes in a way that blames people, but it is an overreaction, or another way to say it. Like I do use that word sometime, and I totally get where you're coming from though. So just use whatever words feel comfortable. Another way of looking at it, it's a reaction that's out of proportion to the situation. And why I might say that I use the word overreaction, because I think it's important when any of us react that way. I certainly do too. Um, I'm going to joke. I'm Italian. My husband thinks I'm overreacting all the time. But I will say to somebody, oh, I just overreacted. I'm sorry. I know. And then you move on. Like, so what? We all do that. But it absolutely, trauma-based fears and reactions may be out of proportion to the situation. And they're very real. So I want people to understand that. There's another thing, if this is okay, I want to get back to around using food. Some people, when they're children or adolescents, trying to cope with extraordinary circumstances and in overwhelming circumstances that they have obviously no control over changing for the most part until maybe you're an adolescent, and you may want to tell somebody what's going on if you haven't been able to, or that's when teens may run away. When you're younger, it's kids don't tell on their parents. Now, I know I'm talking a lot about abuse in the family, and that's not all it is by any means. But whatever the trauma or difficult situation is that they're dealing with without adequate support, children may turn to food because it's accessible, it's easy. There's maybe candy or whatnot in the home, or they don't need a lot of money to buy something at the corner store. So it's accessible that way. That may be the first, quote, substance that they discover helps fill them up emotionally, helps calm their body. Certain foods, high fat, salty kinds of things, especially high fat and sugary, may tend to, because it could be a distraction, but it can tend to calm oneself, and just settle the unsettledness by just using a substance to cope and to feel somewhat grounded. And there are lots of reasons why, like I said, could be a distraction, could be just numbing to the feeling. Some people I've worked with, some adults I've worked with, when I've taken a history, they didn't start using food, they'll tell me, until they were older. But then I may discover that when they were somewhat younger, they may have smoked cigarettes, they may have used alcohol, And then perhaps they stopped smoking, they stopped drinking, but they didn't necessarily deal with what was underneath the need to self-medicate, so to speak. And then they discovered that food did the trick. And it's also not only something that we may eat or put in one's mouth, eat, drink, or smoke. Sex, gambling, shopping, those are addictive behaviors that can also have a numbing quality, so to speak, or a distraction. It also activates the reward centers in the brain that gets you out of your head for a moment when you're, say, shopping. Or so there are other kinds of substances as well. So many of my clients, many of the people I've worked with started with food in childhood because it's so easy, but not everyone did.
I like that you use the word self-medicating because that is so spot on.
Mhm.
If we don't feel good, we all need, want,
Right,
and deserve to
right,
feel good. And we don't always know how to get there. And I like that you mentioned we use all different types of coping mechanisms. It could be food, drinking, shopping,
right,
it can rear its head in many different forms. And I think that's an important connection for a lot of people to make because they may not have realized that. I call it whack-a-mole. It's kind of like that carnival game where one thing pops up and you whack it down, but then it just pops up somewhere else. So if you don't deal with this, it's going to keep popping up somewhere in your life. And
right,
we feel like, okay, once we've stopped drinking and go to AA, and then people start eating or turning to cigarettes. And those are all the addictive, the self soothing, the mood boosting, the numbing out behaviors that help us in the moment feel better, but are ultimately destructive to our lives. So I love that you're helping people not just make that connection, but giving them tools
right.
that they can use now to cope because all these addictive behaviors aren't serving us and
Mhm.
we want to get out of them, but we don't know how.
One of the things I talk about in my book, or describe in my book, is to create for one's create and for those listeners a what's called a self, what I call a self-care basket. Because in the moment when you're triggered, it's hard. You're hijacked. Your mind is hijacked, and it's easy to then just use something quickly to ground yourself and to regain equilibrium. And I also want to add, before I go into more about what this self-care basket can is, healing from emotional eating doesn't mean you'll end it completely. It's really about adding other ways of self-soothing that may not have even been apparent to you, other ways to calm yourself, ground yourself, settle yourself, feel a little bit better. So it's not only about stopping. I like to have people think of this as what can I bring into my life that will help me when I'm feeling overwhelmed? And if you're still using food sometime, that's okay. As I say, there's a chapter in my book, Transforming Self-Punishment into Self-Compassion. And I say that, and this is so important, healing emotional eating is not about not emotionally eating. It's about how you handle it when you do emotionally eat. If you're beating yourself up, for many people listening, they may be beating themselves up the way they may have been mistreated when they were growing up. And it's the cycle perpetuates. When you respond to an episode of emotional eating, with self love, self acceptance, self compassion, you're breaking the cycle. That's more important than whether or not you ate a sleeve of cookies. So that's a really important thing. It's how you handle it when you do. Many people may use food for comfort. People who don't have a quote issue with emotional eating may use food sometimes. That's okay. The main difference is, for the most part, they don't beat themselves themselves up afterwards. They may notice that, oh, I wish I ate a little bit too much. I don't feel all that great, but they're not flogging themselves with shame and guilt for the most part. Those who struggle with trauma-based emotional eating generally do flog themselves with guilt and shame. So I kind of digressed a little bit. I want to get back to the self-care basket. So what this is find a beautiful basket or a beautiful box that you have in your home that you fill with items that you have discovered help soothe you, help ground yourself, help you feel connected with somebody else. So, for example, one thing very simply you could put in your box are names of people to call when you're upset, those go-to, best friends that you can reach out to. That's something very simple that in that moment you might not think of that. Just a list of people you can call. Another thing may be, now I'm going to list different things that I use that are comforting to me. I love herbal teas. So somebody, if you enjoy herbal teas and you find it soothing, put herbal teas in your basket. So it's just something you look at. I love to knit. I have knitting projects all the time. That grounds me when I'm feeling overwhelmed. I mean, it's pretty amazing. And there's research for anybody who does like handwork, crochet, grounding, needlepoint, embroidery, those kinds of activities are shown to be almost meditative and relaxing because you're focusing on one thing, a stitch, a knit, and it gets you out of your head. When we're out of our head and focusing on the present moment with an activity like that and using your hands, that can be really calming as well. A jigsaw puzzle, or even like a small jigsaw puzzle, it's the same theory. You're focusing on one thing. It could be a playlist of music that's grounding and soothing that you could put in there. I talk in my book about creating a sacred shawl practice. I have a shawl right here. And it's basically, and you could put your shawl in your basket. And briefly, because I'm digressing a little bit with that strategy, which is a beautiful one, but it's a way to enlist support from whatever your higher power may be, whether that's God, whether that's your wise self, whether that's consciousness, nature. But you take a shawl and there's a simple prayer that you can tweak any way you want, but you're blessing your shawl with the energy of your higher power. And for example, may this shawl be blessed with your love and support. When I feel weak, help me feel strong. When I feel anxious, help me feel grounded. When I feel scared, help me feel safe. May I feel safe and secure in the shelter of your loving embrace. Think of a weighted blanket and how a weighted blanket is used for anxiety and can help calm and soothe the body, or swaddling a baby in a blanket, it's calming to the nervous system. Hugging yourself with your shawl, maybe stroking your arms with your shawl, is another thing you could use when you're triggered. Just like breathing, nobody needs to know when you're breathing diaphragmatically or using four-step breathing. It's with you all the time, your breath. And a shawl, you could have several to bring with you to different places. They're always a good accessory, and you can hug yourself with your shawl, knowing you're enlisting support with your higher power. And that's another thing to use when you're triggered and to put in your basket. And so,
I love that you have us preparing something in
exactly.
advance because I mean it's almost like meal prepping for me.
Yeah,
If you don't have your food ready before the week starts, when you come home hungry, you're not going to eat a healthy meal because that's not going to be available to you. And so it's
exactly.
sort of like a strategy to have these tools in your back pocket. And I all the things that you're talking about, especially like the warm things like tea, those are things that I love to give myself that are comforting. And I like the way you put it, you are giving yourself that love and care and compassion that you needed back then that you weren't getting. It's almost like
Exactly.
mothering yourself. And not only
Yeah.
that, you're also reaching out to your higher power to say, I
Mm.
need some comfort. Can you
Mm.
please be here with me and comfort me? Because I'm feeling alone. I'm feeling lonely. I'm feeling sad. Whatever it is, those feelings that are coming up. And so I love all of these tools. And I want to thank you so much for your book and for the work that you do. And I want to mention that Diane has a free mini e-course for anyone who's listening who resonates with the conversation that we've had before. It's 5 trauma-informed tips to heal emotional eating. And Diane, your website is dianepetrella.com. Is that
Yeah.
correct?
Yeah, just my name.
Perfect. So there will be a link to her website so that you can take her free e-course in the show notes. And I want to thank you so much for being here. And this has been just an absolutely golden conversation. I know that a lot of women listening are seeing themselves mirrored
Yeah.
in the things that we have talked about. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure. I'd like to add one quick thing. I know we're running late that I didn't mention. When your body's reacting like that, you might want to put in your self-care basket, take a walk, move your body, vacuum do something physical, because calming is good, but so is moving your body as well. And I hadn't mentioned that. I wanted to get that in. I know we're running out of time, but
Perfect.
it
Perfect.
was,
Yes, absolutely. All these different coping mechanisms that make us feel good. And that's what we need. That's what we all need and want and deserve to have. And different things will work for different people.
at different times. Something might work
Yes,
at one point, but it might the next. That's why having a series of things is useful.
absolutely.
This
That's
was
all
lovely.
the time
Thank
we
you
have
so
today. Yes,
much.
thank you, Diane, for being here. And thank you
I,
all for listening in. And until next time, I will see you then. Thank you so much for being here. I'm honored that you've chosen to spend your time with me and allowed me to be part of your journey. If you like what you're hearing, remember to subscribe to the podcast and share it with anyone you think would benefit. I'll see you soon.